elephant in academia. At this moment, I'll introduce to you our esteemed professor, Professor Peter Quartey. Please, let's recognize him with a round of applause.
Thank you very much for the elaborate presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you had a very busy day, a very fulfilling day. This is the last session, but I'm sure you will enjoy it because it ties very much with the elegant presentation that was done before we went on break. So you will indeed enjoy. We are going to look at women's use of smartphones, expanding access, enhancing autonomy. And I'm sure you heard some of those in the previous presentation. Enhancing access, expanding access, enhancing autonomy. This can be a whole conference. I mean, just these two. There'll be a lot to talk about, but we'll do this in 55 minutes. We all know that smartphones are a vital gateway to digital connectivity for women in low and middle income countries. However, many face persistent barriers in accessing and meaningfully using these devices, ranging from cost, limited digital literacy, to restrictive cultural norms. These challenges raise critical questions about how we can not only put smartphones into women's hands, but also ensure they continue to use them in empowering ways. This session will present the much anticipated headline results from the two impact evaluations of smartphone distribution programs in Malawi and in India. The only known studies to date examining the mid to long-term effects of such programs on women's empowerment in this context. Supported by We Define initiative, the studies offer new insights into what works, what doesn't work, and what remains to be addressed. The presenters will explore key findings, practical implications, and persistent challenges. Each presenter will have about 20 minutes, and then we'll leave the rest for questions. We have two main presenters. We want to be very efficient with our time, so they will both present back to back, note your questions, and then when they finish, we'll ask questions and have discussions. Then we can say goodbye to each other, go and rest, and come tomorrow. I have very able presenters. We have Professor Philip Roessler. I hope I got the name right. From the College of William and Mary. Is Professor William here, or we presenting online? Yes. Please take your seat. No, yeah. No, you take a seat first. So okay. you go. Yes, please. Professor Roessler is the Margaret Hamilton Associate Professor of Government at William and Mary, where he also serves as Associate Chair of the Government Department, Co-Director of the Digital Inclusion and Governance Lab, and the Director of the African Research Center at William and Mary Global Research. He holds a PhD from the University of Maryland, and he's going to present on improving women's economic empowerment through mobile phones and training in Malawi. So that's the first presenter. Then the second presenter, I hope he's here, or is he here or is online? We have Simone, yes. Oh, yes, we are gender balanced. Yes, please come over. We have Simone Schaner, right? Schaner, yeah. From University of Southern California. She's going to present on pathway to women's empowerment through smartphone and enabled digital finance. Simone is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Southern California and a Scientific Director for Gender and Inclusion Economics. She has been a member of several organizations, affiliated with several organizations, research organizations, including JPAL, SEGA, NBER, and holds a PhD from MIT. And talking of MIT, ladies and gentlemen, we used to have an old professor who studied in MIT, and when he presents a paper and you criticize him, he'll tell you, I'm from MIT, you know. But I hope she is not. Yes, she won't do that. You are free to ask questions. Me. Yeah. Okay, so on that note, let me invite the first presenter, which is Philip. Please, you have 20 minutes to present. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter, for the nice introduction, and thanks again to BRAC and IPA for hosting this fantastic convening. So I will be presenting joint work with a research team, including Dr. Shreya Bhattacharya, who is at William & Mary, Tanu Kumar at the World Bank, Peter Curl at University of Michigan, Peter Boni Dulani, who's at the Institute of Public Opinion and Research in Zomba, Malawi, and then Dan Nielsen at University of Texas. So if we can go to the next slide, so the motivation here is pretty self-evident. We want to think about what is the impact of digital connectivity, owning a smartphone on economic well-being. So we all are beneficiaries of the smartphone revolution, many maybe even benefiting right now. And why do we value our smartphones so much? Because they're this incredible enabling technology, right? They increase our access to information, new forms of communication, access to all kinds of digitized services. And now, of course, with generative AI, we have generative AI at our fingertips. So when thinking about digital connectivity, probably the most to benefit are those with the biggest constraints to access to information and communication, right? So we can think about low-income households, other marginalized communities. They would benefit most from this technology. But of course, there are serious, severe structural constraints that hinder their access. So next slide. So there's a growing body of research of what is the benefits of smartphone access. And of course, not just with the smartphone comes this access to digital connectivity. We've seen other research showing how digital connectivity can lead to economic transformation in terms of labor shift, moving maybe from the farm sector to self-employment, to to formal employment. We also seen, of course, the great body of work supported by We Define and others on access to digital financial services. The mobile phone, of course, is your wallet, as we know so well. And then, of course, as we've had the digitization of the economy, we have all these service providers supplying valuable services, healthcare services, news services, communication services, that we can access on our phones. So in this study, if we go to the next slide, we build on this research, but what we do in a novel way is to implement a randomized controlled trial among women who do not have phones to causally identify what is the impact of smartphone ownership. Right? So there's a large body of research thinking about the benefits of digital connectivity, but very few randomized control trials, right? So many studies leverage the expansion of connectivity, maybe going from 2G, where you don't have internet access, going to 3G to 4G, and seeing how that rolls out to measure the impact of digital connectivity. And that can give us very nice general equilibrium effects. But of course, we also have challenges with identification, but it also only gives us the average treatment effect, right? So as 3G, 4G rolls out, we can look at the average effect, but what about those low-income households, right? Are they benefiting or are they not? So I'm going to walk you through the randomized control trial that we've done in Malawi and what we find. First, if we go to the next slide, we can look at the contributions kind of think about what we do in our study that is kind of novel and different. First, very few randomized controlled trials on life with and without a smartphone, right? But we also not just look at that, but we benchmark a smartphone to the equivalent value of receiving a cash transfer, right? So what is better, $70 cash in hand or a smartphone? And in the context of Malawi, among our population, that's 1 month of spending, right? Would you rather have 1 month of spending or a smartphone, right? Our design also allows us to identify what's the best mode of providing, distributing, and training beneficiaries and users in the smartphone. Is it women training women individually on their own with other women, or is it training women with their husbands with them? We also have short-term effects, but also longer-term effects, and that's the great. You'll hear from Simone very after me, and they also are able to look at long-term effects. So it's nice because we both can reflect on longer-term effects of these interventions. And thanks to WeDefine, at our end line, we were not only able to interview and survey the women beneficiaries, but we were all the women were married. We were also able to interview their husbands independently, right? So we have very nice intra-household measures of the impact of this technology. So if we go to the next slide, I can walk you through the research design. So we're working in southern Malawi. We're working in Blantyre. We work with village development committees to recruit women from low-income households. And at the beginning of our study at baseline, none of the women owned a phone, any phone. They may have had a phone in the past, but at the time they did not have a phone. And the households, on average, only 30% of households had a phone, right? So these are kind of low connectivity households. Nearly all of the women, their only source of income was informal labor called ganyu, in which they made about $4 per week. And so again, the smartphone was $70, right? So that's 4 months of work to save up to buy the smartphone. And our participants were kind of clustered in villages. We had around 80 plus villages in which participants were located. And so around 17 participants per village, but we randomized at the individual level. So within villages, you would get some women who would receive smartphones and other women in the same village who were in the control group, right? So it's very important for us to think about spillover. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see our overall design, right? So among these 1,500 women, so you go to the next slide, we assigned 800 to 2 smartphone groups, which I'll talk about. 400 received the cash treatment, equivalent value of the phone as a cash grant, unconditional cash grant, and then the 300 were in control. So if we go to the next slide, I can explain the difference between the individuals and couples treatment. So the individuals and couples treatment were identical. In these treatments, the women were the recipients of the phone. They received a certificate of ownership. They received a SIM card registered in their name, and they received hands-on digital training, including signing up for WhatsApp and sending a WhatsApp message. And our digital training, it was a one-off training, but we sought it to be as instructive and intensive as it could be. So the individual treatment, the women came, as you can see, they came individually, but were with other groups of women also receiving the phones. In the couples treatment, everything was identical. Women recipient of the phone, certificate of ownership, SIM card registration, hands-on training. But as you can see, they were trained side by side with their husband. And 95% of husbands came to the training, right? So if we go to the next slide, the other thing that was different about the couples training is we worked with Jeanette, a women's empowerment organization based in Blantyre. And as you can see, one of the Jeanette leaders, also at the couples group, they did a session on strengthening women's property rights over the smartphones, right? So these smartphones are going to the women, and we recognize and affirm kind of their property rights. Our expectation was the couples training, right, where you are trained side by side with your husband, right? 2 minds are better than one. You would learn together, could continue to learn together. Who's laughing? You're preempting my. Two minds are better than one, maybe, right? And then you have this, digital partner who you can talk about the phone, right? And the husband recognizes the women's property rights, right? Okay. So the next slide we'll see the cash treatment, right? So the cash treatment was identical to the individual's treatment, right? Where we had the same kind of empowerment training. This is a valuable asset. In one case, it's a smartphone. The other case, it's a cash grant, right? And this is for you, the women, to receive, to use as you would like. But we hope it's beneficial to you, right? You can use it, to empower yourself and also your household. Right? And you can see the women came individually and received the cash grant. Okay, so program. We go to the next slide. The program implementation. So you may, I don't know if some attended the last We Define conference. I presented the midline findings. Now we're looking at the end line. Again, we surveyed both participants and their husbands independently. And then after that, we did a follow-up phone survey with as many of the participants we could reach to learn more about kind of social learning. And then we've also, supported by IPA's IPV initiative, we've done qualitative interviews with everyone in our study. Not everyone, but a sample, and focus group discussions, which have also been very illuminating. So if we go to the next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first talk about, okay, so what happened to the phones, right? Very important. What were the impact of these smartphones on participants' digital capabilities and mobile money use? What were the distribution of gains within the household, right? How much did the women digital skills increase vis-a-vis the men? And then what are the, what are the economic impact of these interventions? Okay, so first, mobile phone uptake. If we go to the next slide, and then the next slide. So one question is, okay, these are women who did not own phones, right? What happens when you give them a smartphone, right? Are they able to effectively use them? So if we go to the next slide, and we do find after 9 months, you do have effective use of these smartphones. Nearly half are using WhatsApp. A third are using WhatsApp weekly, right? We show that they have mobile money fluency, that they're able to. We have a behavioral outcome where we measure whether they're actually using mobile money. We see kind of strong effects. They're using it regularly for mainly phone calls, less SMS. So we do see take up of the intervention, which is a fair question, right? Right? I mean, these women don't have phones. Should you leapfrog to smartphones, right? We do see after 9 months some non-retention of the phones, but we also see that the cash group, we have a little bit of increase. Remember, everyone's starting at 0, right? So the cash group and even the control start to acquire some phones as well. So after 32 months, if we go to the next slide, we can see that the retention, this is showing different measures of whether you still have the smartphone. So after 32 months, only 25% of women still have the phone on their person, right? So 75% no longer have the smartphone. And that is a large loss. But also, what is the life cycle of a smartphone, right? This is nearly 3 years later, right? How old is your smartphone, right? So what we find is that women, one concern when you talk to economists is you give someone a phone, they're going to sell it, right? And turn it to cash. No, they don't sell the phone. But unfortunately, these are entry-level smartphones. I mean, these are not the cheapest phones you could get in Malawi. These are a phone one would get at the market, but they're not durable. So if we go to the next slide, what happens to phones? We find that many malfunction, right? Especially after 3 years. So if we go to the next slide, most women in our study don't have electricity at their home. How do you charge a phone if you don't have electricity? Where do you go? You go to the public charging station. Very kind of sad to read the number of phones that went bad charging at an irregular electricity supply, right? We take for granted the shelter, like all our devices, technology here at GIMPA are well sheltered in case it rains, right? Many have environmental damage and then physical breakage. So that the amount of loss, so when we think about the impact of technology, it's only as robust as the devices are durable. And no one talks about that, right? What do you think? Oh, the market will solve it, right? So what cheap interventions can we do to make devices more durable? How many people use a smartphone case, right? How many of our participants did? None. Not many, right? Okay, so the next slide. Now it's very important. We randomize at the individual level, right? So we had this roster of 1,500 people, and then we did a random draw into the 4 groups, and they were clustered from these 80 plus villages. So some got a smartphone and some didn't. Would you know if someone else in your village got a smartphone and you didn't? Many of the women knew, right? 90% picked up on this. And this is very important because we do see social learning and spillover effects that we need to take into account when thinking about our effects. But 90% of participants said, yes, I know someone who got a smartphone. And yes, it increased my interest in mobile technology. Okay. And so that might account for, so we go to the next slide, that might account for some in the control group and the cash group getting smartphones. They didn't get smartphones. Sorry. So we have no spillovers very little spillovers in terms of smartphones, right? So if the effect is through a smartphone, the integrity of our randomization is intact, the experiment's intact. If the effect is through a mobile phone, we have to take into account for spillovers. So now, if we go to the next slide, the husbands. What's interesting? We go to the next slide. What's interesting is that the participants' husbands had no increase in mobile phone ownership compared to the control, right? So it seems like giving the women a phone made their husbands no more likely to get a phone on their own. Why not? Probably because they also use the phone. But what's interesting is the cash husbands did acquire phones. You give a $70 cash grant to these households, to the women, and their husbands acquired phones, right? Much more than control. Now, this is not just them, I think, capturing the cash grant. The cash grant led to economic benefits, dividends for the household. That increased their spending, and that spending went to the husband acquiring the phone. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So, one concern is individuals versus couples. Would you see any difference in access? Right? We see actually no difference in access. Right? You give a woman to a phone individually or couples with their husband there, their future access is the same, which was reassuring. Right? One concern is you bring the husband in, he's going to take it. You don't bring in the husband in, he's going to take it. We don't see differences between individuals and couples on access. And even if we go to control, right? Access is not control. If you go to the next slide, actually on control, women in the couples group 3+ years later tend to have more control as measured by, am I free to use the phone as much as I want, right? Does the husband allow me support my phone use? It's not large, but it's positive. It's not negative. So if your concern is you bring the husband into this training, he's going to appropriate the phone. We do not see evidence of that, right? If anything, our couples intervention worked in the sense that the phone control among the women, the couples was stronger. Okay, what about capabilities and mobile money use? This is where if we go to the next couple slides, this is where we see differences, right? And here where it runs against our expectation. Our expectation would the couples treatment would lead, so we can go to the next slides, next 2 slides. The couples treatment would lead to greater digital capabilities. But what we see is actually the individual's treatment over 3 years led to better digital capabilities using an index measure. Digital capabilities kind of declines over time among the smartphone groups. Why? Because non-retention. But it remains strongest in the individuals group. And we have, if we go to the next slide, we look at mobile money use. And our mobile money use is an index as well, but it also includes behavioral measures. It is a very good measure of how capable you are of using mobile money behaviorally. And we can see again, the individual's training and treatment led to stronger mobile money proficiency, right? And so again, this is not because individual women had necessarily better access. Access was the same. It seemed like the training women on their own, if we go to the next slide, without their husband, it led to better learning, right? They were, if you look at this photo, it like sums it up. Here I am on my own, right, with other women, and I'm holding the phone and I'm engaged. When your husband's there, what are you doing? Literally, right? What are you doing? And that's great. It's good to defer to a partner, but it can also diminish one's learning. It can diminish one's sense of agency. It can also reinforce gendered structures of knowledge. Who is the expert going in? None of these women have phones. If someone has a phone, who is it? The husband, right? So you might not think you might not think about it, but you turn to your husband because they're the expert. When you're on your own, you don't turn to your husband. You learn on your own. And 3 years later, that matters for actual digital capabilities. And one mechanism might be through social learning. Speaking of social learning, when you're there with your husband, what are you doing? You're huddled in with your husband. When you're there with other women, what are you doing? You're turning to other women. And what we see is that individuals, if you go to the next slide, are more likely to be more attuned to peer learning, peer effects. What are other women in the village doing with their smartphones? They're in a measure of social learning index. How much do you pay attention to what other women are doing? How much do you talk to them about smartphones? The effects are strongest through the individuals. So that might be one of the, so the very important to think of training and intervention, individuals versus couples. Okay, so we see that individual distribution of smartphone and training, it does matter, right? Increased digital, so what? What about the economic effects? Here we see, oh, I didn't have time to get to this. We can skip through this. The gains within the household reinforce what we see, that the individual's treatment actually reduces digital gender inequality within the household. And the cash grant actually worsens it, right? So the husbands in the cash group are getting the phones and actually the knowledge. But when it comes to economic effects, what we see is that the cash grants were much more effective. We see this after 9 months. So what do the women do with the cash grant? They don't buy phones, right? What do? They invest it in micro enterprise. They always think, I had this business in mind. Now I've got the capital to do it, and I do it. And lo and behold, after 9 months, there's like this virtuous cycle of you got the micro enterprise, you're more active in your savings group, right? Things are looking good. And we see consistent economic gains after 9 months. Things start to diminish after 3 years. Micro enterprise is tough business, but they still persist. And you can see this effect if you go to the next slide. But the gains are also not just through the women, but the husband as well, right? It seems like the cash grant led to better economic gains. The smartphone digital capabilities don't translate into economic gains, right? Because they're not using the capabilities for economic activity, right? Many people 75% continue to do casual informal labor, piecework, ganyu. How do you get hired for ganyu? You show up at the same spot in the village week in, week out. Like a digital connectivity does not get you out of that situation. So we have to think about, are there opportunities for digital economic employment gains? This is where it comes to the ecosystem effects. So just to sum up, because I know I'm out of time, so if you go to the very last slide, you can see the takeaways. So what we see is that intentional digital training, digital interventions do matter over 32 months, right? They can increase women's individual digital capabilities. They can reduce the digital gender gap. Giving women cash does not have that same effect. And if it actually worsens digital inequality in the household. But cash grants do improve the economic empowerment of that. So we have this trade-off, right? If we do digital intentional activities, that can increase digital inclusion, but that might not lead to economic empowerment. If we do cash grants, that does not translate into digital inclusion, but it can lead to, over 3 years, lift up the economic empowerment of the house. We think maybe enough time goes, maybe those women will get more digitally included, but we see the first movers are their husbands, right, in terms of digital inclusion. So a lot to think about in terms of the trade-offs we face here and future interventions. And Simone can now walk us through this.
Thank you very much. I think he deserves another round of applause.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for sticking with this. Good afternoon.
Absolutely.
Okay, so good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
That's better. That's better. We're going to end on a high note. So thanks so much. It's really great to be able to present this on a panel with Phil because I think there are some important similarities, in our studies, which are situated in very, very different cultural contexts on completely different contexts. If you go to the next slide, I guess one of the benefits of going second is on similar projects is you have similar motivations. But I do want to take 1 second to just step a bit back and think, big picture, like why are we doing this work? And on some level, I think it's a really interesting time to be working in this space and that we are, kind of really at a moment where it feels like there's a tremendous amount of political, social, and technological change going on in the world. And, I think as Phil had nicely outlined, there's reasons to be optimistic about some of this technological change. Almost 5 billion people now, I think this number on the top bullet has gone up to 4.7 per the last GSMA report. Nearly 5 billion people around the world are now using mobile internet. We know from previous research that, phones can facilitate access to information, improve market functioning, develop all these apps and value-added services. And, as he mentioned, for marginalized groups like women, maybe they've been excluded from information, they've been excluded from markets. And it's like, if you can bring all of that into a person's hand and make it easy to digest, it's really promising in terms of being able to close digital gender gaps. Now, if you go to the next slide, the challenge, of course, is that just like we see gender gaps in many other economic outcomes, we see exactly the same, in the digital world. So this is just a map from the Gallup World Poll showing the gender gap in use of smartphones across the world. And you can see that the gaps are largest in the yellow to red color in South Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, which is precisely where we think, these technologies might be most beneficial. And so I think there's a real risk here, and that if we think that in order to fully participate in the modern economy and shift, just the nature of technological change, if we think being digital is necessary for that, these kinds of gaps could serve to leave women even further behind. And so in that sense, there's an urgent need to ask, why do these digital gender gaps exist? What might we do about them? If you move to the next slide, I kind of want to show you a few more pictures from the Gallup World Poll just to understand how thorny this issue is. So this is the same, each dot is a country. You can see all the sub-Saharan African countries are in green color. So if you're especially interested in that, you can pay attention to this color. And on the x-axis here, I'm just graphing the gender gap in access to secondary education. So higher numbers, bigger gender gap. And on the y-axis, the vertical axis, is the gender gap in smartphone ownership. And what you can see is that, in places where there's existing gender gaps in education, you have existing gender gaps or larger gender gaps in smartphone ownership. If you go to the next slide, gaps are also larger when women are less economically engaged. I've kept that Y vertical axis exactly the same and shifted the X axis out to now show the gap in labor force participation. And what you can see is when women are less engaged in the economy or less likely to work, gaps are larger. One thing I think is very interesting is you can see all the green dots in sub-Saharan Africa. I guess Africa punches above its weight in terms of labor force participation gaps, and that they're low, yet smartphone gaps are higher. And if you go to the next slide, you see that gaps are also larger when gender norms are more conservative. So the Gallup World Poll doesn't have I don't think it's great for measures of social norms, but what I'm graphing on the x-axis now is the percent of people in that survey that agree that men and women have equal rights. So, higher numbers means more agreement that men and women should have equal rights, sort of more progressive gender norms. And what you can see is that smartphone gap on the y-axis is going down, getting smaller when there's more support for gender equality, right? So we kind of see that this digital access gap is kind of tied up with norms. It's tied up with women's participation in the economy. It's tied up in women's literacy and education and human capital in general. Go to the next slide. I think for both practitioners, policymakers, and academicians alike, this raises a really important question, which is how should we be in the business of evaluating digital inclusion policies in an environment where there's so many pre-existing gender inequalities, right? How should I think of really effectively reaching women when we know that they're starting from a lower base to begin with? So unfortunately, I only have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to walk you through our framework, but together with my colleagues at, yeah, you can go to the next slide. Oh, nope, sorry, go back. You can go back again. Let's have the QR code up there for a minute. Together with my colleagues at Harvard, Yale, Warwick, Duke, we've sort of done a lot of work on this in India and sort of put together a framework to help help practitioners really think about navigating this process in a way that is embedded in cultural context and household decision-making power. So I won't walk through the framework, but it's on the Inclusion Economics website. I encourage you all to check it out. And what I do want to spend a little bit more time on, if you go to the next slide, is talking a little bit more about some of the research that really informed our thinking for that brief, which is to focus on this affordability metric, which we sort of know is important. But so if you kind of address affordability, without perhaps putting too much more thought to gender dynamics, what might happen in both the short and long term in terms of women's engagement with digital technology and downstream outcomes. So for that, I want to tell you about this free smartphone distribution that was implemented by a state government in India. If you go to the next slide. This project took place in an Indian state called Chhattisgarh. On the left-hand side, you can see some summary statistics to know a little bit more about Chhattisgarh. It's one of the poorest states in India. Kind of around the time of our study, it's sort of been making progress in terms of female phone ownership, going from about 31 to 41% per 2020. And in this state, women are actually a little bit more engaged in the labor force than you see in other states. So I'd sort of like maybe medium levels of gender norms for India. And we started working in the state around 2018 when the state recognized that women were digitally excluded and decided to engage in a statewide smartphone distribution where the vision was that every female head of household in rural areas would get access to a smartphone with free data for, I think, at least 6 months. So this distribution took place between August and September of 2018, and the government distributed almost 3 million phones across rural areas. They also invested significantly expanding the network, so they identified places that didn't have 4G LTE access. They built towers. And kind of made some, I would say, not very strong efforts to do a little bit of digital literacy training, and also preloaded the phone with government apps with the idea that this would become a way for the government to reach out directly to citizens. Okay, if you move to the next slide. I think one thing that's kind of fun about this project is that I'm going to show you 3 sets of results using 3 different methodologies to produce plausibly causal estimates of the impact of this program. In order to learn the short run effect, we're going to leverage a baseline survey we did for an RCT where we ran surveys in 212 program eligible villages in one district of India. We just randomly assigned villages to be interviewed either 2 to 3 weeks before phone distribution versus 2 to 3 weeks after. So this is a before-after comparison. You have to sort of assume that there are sort of no other major shifts in the world within that kind of 1 to 1.5 month time frame. And we'll sort of assume that those are minimal and that differences we see between these 2 groups are due to the causal effect of the program. Over the long run, what we're going to do is a much larger survey across almost 700 villages in 13 districts across the state. And we're going to leverage kind of a convenient thing that the government did for our purposes, which is when doing the distribution program, they said, everyone who lives in a village that has a population of 1,000 or more per the 2011 Indian census gets this program. Everyone that lives in a village that had 999 or fewer people per the 2011 Indian census does not get this program. And so what we're going to do is compare average outcomes just on either side of that discontinuity to learn the causal effect of the program, okay? You can go to the next slide. And so, you know, in the short run, and I should say the government did a really, really good job of distributing phones under this initiative. And, you know, I'll walk you through these graphs because I'm going to show you a bunch of them. What you can do is that first bar on the left-hand side is kind of showing you the average outcome sort of before the distribution or in communities where there's no distribution. That second bar is showing you the treatment effect or the causal effect of the program. And these little whiskers are showing you the 90 and 95% confidence interval. So, you know, anytime these whiskers are different from that dashed line or the top of the comparison group, we know that the difference is statistically significant. And, you know, I think you sort of see, I would say, three things from this graph. You know, the first graph is showing outcomes at the household level. So does the household have at least one smartphone? The program, you know, kind of, can't see the numbers, I think around 40% of households did have a smartphone prior to the program. After, access is almost universal at the household level. And what you can see in the next two graphs is that there are sort of very large impacts on women. Women are the last one here, where, you know, only 5% of women had a smartphone of their own prior to the program. That goes up by 56 percentage points, you know, kind of, whereas you see that, you know, men were 21% of them had a smartphone before the program, but their ownership also goes up, right? So even 2 to 3 weeks after the program, you sort of see some transfer of those phones from the hands of women, right? This isn't going up to 100% into the hands of their husband, which is in the middle bar, as well as other household members. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And, you know, what's interesting is that in terms of ownership, this free distribution closes and even reverses the gender gap. But when we look at use, right, like are people actually using the phone for different things, we actually see that the gender gap grows. You know, these two panels are just showing us the sort of percent of like smartphone tasks in our survey that men were doing versus women. And what you can see is that distribution is increasing the percent of tasks that both genders are able to do, but the treatment effect for men is larger. It's, you know, kind of 12% instead of 6.5% for women. So, you know, even though the phones are being given to the women, it's actually the men that are using the phone more even in the short run. Okay, you can move to the next slide. Oh, no. Okay, yeah. Okay. So that's all well and good. That's just a few weeks after the program. What happens after 5 years? You know, the answer, unfortunately, is absolutely nothing. And that if you look at on the left-hand side, this is now in our 5-year survey. We're graphing the share of households that have a smartphone. So I think there's two things here. One, like smartphone ownership at the household level 5 years after the program is really ubiquitous. 84% of the households in our survey, and these are very rural parts of India, already have a phone. And this program makes absolutely no difference in the long run. It also has absolutely no impact on wives' ownerships of smartphone. You can see here only 18% of women themselves own a phone. There's no treatment effects. There's also no treatment effects on outcomes like gender norms, even though we see short-run impacts there. And so, you know, there's a sense in which this distribution like maybe gave women a boost in terms of putting a phone in their hands, but that didn't really translate into closing gender gaps in use. And over the long run, as Phil kind of pointed out, these phones stop working. It doesn't create any stickiness or momentum that leads to sustained change. You can go to the next slide. So, you know, I think the policy lesson here is that reducing costs, like especially temporarily, right? This was kind of like a one-off introduction to the smartphone. You know, the next phone they would have had to get on their own may not be enough to close gender gaps when women's have kind of lower returns to phone use, right? I try this out, but if there's not a lot I can kind of do or it doesn't create a compelling value proposition for me, like why should I invest my valuable money in another one of these in the future? So if you go to the next slide, I should say going into this project, we were actually really, really worried about this, in part informed by our framework, which is all about the returns to the phone and decision-making within households. And so the solution we imagined was women-centered digital capability training. We looked really hard for programs in the market and couldn't find any. So we decided to design our own that was focused on a set of core tasks that we thought might be really valuable for women, as simple as dialing, receiving calls, taking a photo, doing a voice search on internet, kind of how to turn the phone on and off. We engaged women in small groups. So this was all women training, interactive practice during the sessions. The sessions were actually pretty short, about 45 minutes, focused on high value skills. And we kind of designed these collaterals that people could take home showing how to do the skills that were meant to be very friendly for somebody that had limited literacy. You can go to the next slide. So this is the last evaluation methodology I'm going to talk about. So this we designed in a randomized evaluation focusing on these 212 program villages within Raipur. And we offered the training in a randomly selected 180 villages to compare to 32 controls. And the follow-up survey is about, kind of taking place around 2.5 years after distribution. So actually very similar to Phil's long-term results that you've already seen. So, the first thing I should point out is training was really popular. About 57% of women who were shortlisted for the training did attend. And what I'm going to show you on the next slides are two impact estimates. One is the effect of being offered training. We economists call this an intent to treat effect. But we know that that's not necessarily going to reflect the benefit to any one woman of getting trained because only half did. So I just compare outcomes for women offered versus not offered. That effect is a bit too small. And so I'll also show you estimates of the effect of attending training called the treatment on the treated, kind of scaling up that estimate for partial compliance. But this does assume that there are no substantial spillover effects of training, which I think is actually a pretty strong assumption, but it's the best we can do in this setting. So what we see is that 2.5 years after distribution, training significantly increases women's phone use, both in terms of basic tasks, things as simple as, making a call, picking up a call, sending an SMS, as well as, kind of more advanced use cases that you can only do with a smartphone, though you can see the sort of share of those tasks that women do is lower. And we also see significant impacts on women's autonomy in terms of being able to use the phone, kind of outside the home. Okay, go to the next slide. We also see that the training liberalized gender norms, but only women's beliefs. So women who are trained are significantly more likely to sort of agree that women are able to use, or it would be appropriate for women to use phones. But there's absolutely no change in men's beliefs, who you could imagine might be the gatekeeper of use in a setting like this. Go to the next slide. And finally, training also increased social connectedness and improved mental health. So we see significant increases in, kind of the number of family members that women say they're on touch with over the phone, which is quite important in an Indian context, because usually when you get married, you're going to move to a different village and you no longer have that in-person connection with your family members. What we see alongside is that there's a significant reduction in the share of women who say that they felt down, depressed, or hopeless. This is part of the PHQ-4. We also see significant impacts on the overall index, specifically the depression components. Women are about 12 percentage points less likely to say that they felt down, depressed, or hopeless in the past 1 to 2 weeks. This is off a base of 65%, right? So this is a setting in which about 2/3 of women are feeling symptoms of depression. Our hypothesis here is that stronger social connections lead to better mental health. It may also be important to think about the fact that we did this training in 2018. And of course, we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic significantly upended, just kind of the way that we connect with others and are able to connect with others in the ensuing year. And, I should kind of note, and one of the reasons I wanted to put those treatment on the treated effects up there is that these effects are pretty big. So our internal estimates is that it costs us about $7 per person to do this training. We think that if we, if it were sort of scaled and you account for the fact that we did a lot of legwork to develop it, you could spend significantly less. So for about $7 per person, you're getting a 12 percentage point reduction in feelings of depression. This compares pretty well to other sort of psychological interventions that are explicitly focused on interventions for depression. I don't have a slide on this, I'm just talking. There's kind of work showing that CBT for depressed mothers in Pakistan reduces depression by about 30% percentage points at 1 year, 5 percentage points at 7 years, for the cost of about $10 per person. You have some evidence from Zimbabwe that a similar training is reducing depression at 6 months by about 36 percentage points at a cost of $16 to $18 per person. But this is kind of an intervention that was not explicitly tailored as a mental health intervention, of course. And we do see some other effects in terms of women being more likely to access financial information at home. I should say we don't see economic effects in this setting, which I think potentially makes sense in that women are pretty limited in terms of economic engagement. And so you might worry a little bit about constraints to their income generating potential, even with access to phones in this setting. Okay, so if you can move forward. In terms of the policy lessons, just click through so you can see all of these, and I'll recap very quickly. This free distribution program provided a short-term boost, but impacts fade out in the long run. And what you'll see in this framework brief that I referred to is that, this may reflect the fact that nothing about giving a woman a phone is going to affect the sort of relative returns or benefits she would derive from a phone as compared to her husband. So if you're working in a setting where the deck is stacked against women, you give her new technology and her husband has, sort of can derive a higher benefit from it. I mean, these are poor households that don't have a lot of resources. They're going to put those resources to where they feel they're best used, right? So that's just not working. However, investing in women's digital capabilities yields lasting benefits. And, one reason why that is like if you teach someone, it's going to increase their returns to using the phone. And so that's going to shift kind of shift things with substantial psychosocial benefits in this setting. So you can move forward. Or is that the end? No, move forward. Okay, yeah. And I think the other thing that you should think about, right, is like if you put a phone in a woman's hand, somebody can take that phone out. If you put ideas in somebody's mind, you can never take that out, right? So there's also this like need to engage in transferability of assets, which is often much easier to do than transferability of knowledge. Okay, and I think that's about it. So I will conclude and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we've had both presentations, very comprehensive. So I will not attempt to summarize. Rather, I'll post one question and then I open it to the audience as well, or make a comment. From the presentation so far, I realize the focus has been on poor women. With the first one, the income of $4 per week. That translates into less than $1 a day. So these are poor people. Now, if you give them handphones or smartphones and it need replacement, if there's no income effect, if they are not moved out of poverty, replacing the phone will be difficult. So we may have limited long-term effects. That's what I picked from this. Let me open up for comments from the floor. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Prof. Chair. I'm permitted to ask persons trained from Yale's and MIT questions. Who am I to critique? I found your paper very interesting, but not surprising. Not surprising again, still with the framing, the lens of diagnosing the problem. If the diagnosis is flawed, then the intervention will be flawed. So from the whole discussion, which part of your conclusion also speaks to that, it's clear that empowerment is not a gift that you can go and give to somebody. Right. And this is what the liberals, the liberal feminists will argue, women have been excluded from the digital space, so include them. In the process of including them, go and give them phone. It will translate into nothing. Right. The raw issues which you pointed out to in the middle of your discussions are the gender inequity issues, the structural patriarchal issues that need to be changed if we really want transformative impacts. But if we don't address the root cause, which has to do with the structural issues, and we keep addressing the face of the wound, nothing, I'm sorry, but nothing will change. Lastly, I'm surprised in your findings, the very last part, I didn't hear anything about negative backlash from the introduction of the phones, because I was expecting that some husbands will be saying that, who are you talking to? And that will increase an abuse, right? Which will increase gender-based abuse, which we've seen in other spaces. We've seen other negative effects of the introduction of the phones, porn, revenge, and all of that. But it appears that it's all, when you give them the training and they are able to, it's all smooth. So I don't know, maybe you found that, but it was shelved. If you could speak to that, I'll be interested. Thank you.
Any more questions, comments? Please be brief and straight to the point.
Thank you very much. From the presentation, I wanted to see or hear from her how they have built their capacity to go into business, and through that, then phones are given to them to transact their businesses. Imagine you come to give me a phone, I don't even have a capital to trade. What happens with the phone? Definitely, by the end of it, I'll have to sell the phone to to make a livelihood. So the whole thing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. But I think one of the first presenters spoke about micro enterprise. But I leave them to address your comments. Any more? Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Antoinette from Soko Academy. When Phil was making his presentation, he said they gave an opportunity for the participants to choose either they want cash or mobile phone.
So they didn't choose, they were assigned to these different groups.
They were assigned.
Yes.
And so when they were giving the mobile phone, and when those who gave what was the why, the motive to give them the phone or the money? Because at the end of the day, you see that those who were giving the money gain more economically, but those who were giving the phone gain. So what did you want to achieve for them to have money or phone? I think I didn't get that side very well.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much to both of you. This is very insightful. So I think two questions, right? So the first one is cash versus phone. What might have been an outcome if there was kind of almost a combination of both, right? So a little bit of cash and maybe a form of system where you're not given the phone fully, but the phone is actually subsidized to some degree. And with that, with the second presentation is, yes, the phone, but what are we using the phone for, right? Because if it's just a question of giving the phone, but in this day and age when everything that's like business related, income generation, activity related is very much done through a phone, and you don't have the skills and the capacity to do that. But if that was given to you, then all of a sudden your phone would have a very different role to play, right? So have we looked at it under these angles to see what would the results be and how different they would be?
It looks like it's a very interesting set of studies, generating a lot of comments and questions. Can we take the last two? last two.
Hello,
Yes.
my name is Comfort from UCC. Actually, I wanted to understand the kind of training intervention. I think it ties in with her question. I hear you say training. What kind of training? Is this training to help them use the phone, or does it have any economic aspects to it, which then we expect after they have used, you've given them the capabilities, then they can go into business, which of course then may translate into economic effect. So I'm now interested in what kind of training programs they were given. Thank you.
Okay, and then the last one.
Hi, my name is Smith. I wanted to ask, what are the operational costs, and do you have estimate how much these people are spending on like recharges, everything on phone? Because, or do you have dynamics of when they like realize it's spending more or less, and is that relating to backlash?
Great. So it means the audience were very attentive. Let's clap for ourselves. Yeah, they passed the test. Well done. All right. Since we started with you, I want to start with you. Yes, thank you.
Okay. It's always the perils of going first. So I'll try to take these in order and maybe leave some that were specifically for Phil for him. So I guess, maybe first, just in terms of like, who am I to critique? Well, I hope that everybody would feel that they're comfortable because, part of scholarly exchange is questioning what you see and we learn from one another. So thank you for asking your question. And I think part of it was to say, maybe two things here. One, there's this question about, was there any negative backlash? Did you measure this? Yeah, we certainly did, both in terms of like men's stated beliefs around women being able to use the phone, kind of emotionally controlling behavior, and, women's ability to step outside the home and use the phone. We don't see any significant impacts of any of that. So maybe that is a surprise, and I think, and I should say, like, I don't know if anybody from GSMA is here, like, I do kind of feel like these results are important and that we spend a lot of time talking to practitioners. And I think a lot of practitioners, for very sensible reasons, are like laser focused on bringing costs down. I think a lot of people think like this is going to solve the problem. And so part of what we want to do with rigorous evidence is build as compelling a case as possible that, like this is and that's a base, right? I would kind of argue that making phones more affordable is like a first step, but you're going to have to layer stuff on top of that if we want to meaningfully lift women up. I think there were sort of some questions around, was there capacity building in terms of business? What were you kind of helping people to achieve? What kind of training intervention? Our work was very much focused on just giving women kind of the capability to use the phone and leaving it to them to decide, how it should be best put to use. If you think about something like WhatsApp, it really is a multi-purpose tool. You can use it to market and run your business, but you can also use it to stay in touch with family and friends and follow groups that are giving you information about the world. What we find in our setting is kind of my sense is that the thing that was like most compelling to people is actually the connectivity piece, just in terms of being able to be connected to others, and that matters for women's mental health, which I also think is a surprise. I think, I can't speak for like the Ghanaian context, but in the West, there's a lot of anxiety that, phones are making us unhappy and depressed and too much stress. And we find for these women who are socially isolated, it can also be a lifeline, right? So maybe the work is to figure out how to get people to that happy medium. And then I think the operational cost will be unsatisfied with my answer. We asked. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I do think contrasting these studies is a little bit interesting because the cost of data in India is actually quite low relative to other countries. I think in many sub-Saharan African countries, I can't speak to Malawi, like data is really, really expensive. I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind. You can think about coming up with a $50 smartphone and coming up with creative ways to finance access to smartphones. But, like I'm working on a project in Kenya where like a payment for a lended smartphone is 20% of people's daily income. That's just to activate the phone. Now you have to pay for data on top of that. It really becomes a very large burden. And so, that creates a set of issues.
This one. Yeah, thank you for the fantastic questions. Yeah, I mean, to speak to Malawi, I mean, I think Malawi is one of the most expensive places in the world for mobile data, right? It's very expensive. But actually, what was striking is that the costs, in terms of the operational costs, participants spent more on charging, going to charging centers or public charging to charge their phones, and that is the problem with the smartphone, right? It's incredibly data intensive, incredibly energy intensive, and we take these things for granted. So that's part of the value of this research, right? Is we in doing an experiment, you carefully process trace, are people taking the vaccine, right? Are they taking and adopting the smartphone, and what are the barriers and costs and the backlash, right? And we too had a number of different modules to capture any impacts on intimate partner violence, any kind of controlling behavior in the household or in the community. And we too we saw no negative effects, null effects, which is encouraging. And again, on the social control, it did seem like the couple's treatment did have this positive effect, more so than the individuals, even though the individual's treatment, the women became more capable. Yeah, and a great question about if you give someone from these low-income households a smartphone, what are they going to do with it? They were thrilled, right? Why were they thrilled? Social connectivity, right? Staying in touch with family and friends was the number one reason people used the phones, and was quite devastating when they lost the phones. But so they were not seeing it as a business tool, an enterprising tool. And like Simone, in our training, it was hands-on training, but inevitably it was a one-off training. So we did not have the opportunity to provide intensive mobile for business training. And this is something we learned, right? But also we wanted to give them the skills to use the device, which they gained, and to learn how they used it, and to see, and definitely there's a lot more room for digital training, so individuals can see how this device can provide them with income generating capabilities. So we definitely saw the impact of the peer learning, but the structured learning around mobile for business, I think, is very important. And I think, oh yeah, the cash for the phone. Yeah, like what's the motivation here? So the motivation is we care a lot about digital inclusion and digital connectivity, right? But we also see a lot of good evidence that cash transfers are super efficient and effective, right? So the benchmark is, if it's so efficient and effective to give people cash, and they know exactly how they can best use cash, why not just give them cash, right? And our study shows that, yeah, when you give these women cash, months worth of consumption, they know exactly what micro enterprise they want to start and invest in right after buying food and other essentials. And they do that, right? And we see the economic benefits. But what we don't see is them investing in digital technology. Maybe for good reason, like Simone's saying, because the economic returns are not there yet, especially in Malawi, in southern Malawi. But we do see that if we care about digital capabilities, because this is the gateway to nearly all of our services, right? The Malawi government, just like the Indian government, is investing a lot in digitizing services. So that digital capability that these women gain also matters, right? And if you just give someone cash, they don't acquire that digital capability on their own. So yeah, the best of both worlds, right? Yeah. Yeah, but we do need to think exactly. But that's something we can learn, right? Without this counterfactual of the cash transfer, we would miss that insight, right? And so now hopefully we get deeper insight that motivates future policy work and research.
Yeah, on a very sound, positive note, I think 3 options: mobile phones, cash, training. And I like the point about the alternative of giving them all three. Give them all three and test. I think that's the beauty of research, that you've done these very beautiful studies, very comprehensive, which I commend you. But directing for future research, look at another alternative where you give them all three, so that mobile for business, you empower them for business. Then you can lift them out of poverty, and perhaps we'll see better outcomes. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had two presenters, one from Yale, one from MIT, who are very receptive to questions and criticisms. So let's applaud them for. And I thank all of you for being so active and making this session an interesting one.
Thank you.